This episode was recorded on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation. Welcome to POSLink Plus Listen, the podcast by and for people living with HIV. Today, LPV Health Promotion Lead Timothy Krulic talks to Bethany Rodgers, a strategic policy lawyer at the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre, Australia's only community legal centre dedicated to HIV and hepatitis-related legal issues. Bethany holds a Bachelor of Laws with honours and a Bachelor of Social Research and Policy from the University of New South Wales, Sydney, and has worked across academic and community settings. Beth has authored many submissions and publications on HIV and the law during her time at HALC on varied topics including employment, privacy, and anti-discrimination laws. Her work aims to improve access to justice, reduce stigma and discrimination, and promote an enabling legal environment for people living with HIV. Tim and Bethany talk about the legal considerations around HIV disclosure and how you can access support. They also talk about the recently relaunched Rights and Responsibilities Guide, Disclosing Your HIV Status, and the accompanying pocket booklet. This podcast is for educational purposes only. Nothing in the podcast constitutes legal advice. We encourage you to reach out to a legal service directly if you have any legal issues you are dealing with or questions about HIV and the law. You can contact HALC on 02 9492 6540 or by emailing halc@halc.org.au.
Hi Beth, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Firstly, can you tell me a bit about HALC and its work?
Of course. So HALC stands for the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre. We're a specialist not-for-profit community legal centre, the only one of our kind in Australia. We work to assist people with HIV and hepatitis-related legal matters. We do a whole range of areas of law. A lot of that work is migration. We also do other common community legal issues like tenancy, housing, employment matters, and the like. We do work Australia-wide, but because of funding limitations, a lot of our work has to focus on the states where we receive our core funding, which at the moment is New South Wales, Queensland, and to some extent other states and territories.
Cool, thank you. So what are some of the main challenges that people experience when navigating HIV-related laws in Australia?
There's quite a few. I would say one of the main challenges and part of the reason that HALC exists is that when they do encounter a legal problem related to their HIV status, it's difficult to find the right answer. They can sort of get confusing or conflicting answers. People might also encounter stigmatizing responses from lawyers or essentially discrimination, and they might not feel comfortable disclosing their status to lawyers as a result. For example, in one area, disclosure that HALC deals with quite a lot, lots of people living with HIV want to uphold their privacy, potentially as a strategy to avoid discrimination, but it might be difficult to get the answer to their disclosure responsibilities, if any, if they approach another lawyer. As well, lawyers are obviously expensive, and our service is free to all our clients.
Okay. Yeah, because that was my next question. Can you tell me more about why privacy is so important for people living with HIV? I guess, as that strategy to protect themselves from discrimination?
Yeah, of course. So unfortunately, a lot of the sort of mistreatment that people living with HIV experience is very much still prevalent today, as I'm sure you know, Tim. And so people are often put in situations where they're sort of explicitly asked to tell, say, an employer. They might have to tell like a accommodation or a service provider as well, their HIV status. So they might be given a form or something like that. And then they might approach HALC and they might ask, hey, like, I don't really want to reveal my HIV status in this situation. It's not really relevant to the job. It's not relevant to the service being provided. But, like, do I need to do this? And so HALC can, in that situation, sort of provide some guidance and some advice about the legal considerations at play. And in those situations, the person, if they didn't have a place to go to or if they didn't have sort of a reliable answer, they might have been put in a spot where they did disclose their status and then unfortunately they sort of were treated poorly as a result, or they just weren't necessarily comfortable entering that situation.
Yeah, so I guess that's that brings us to I guess the disclosure guides that HALC has been producing since since 2016 around then.
I think about then, yeah, there's a South Australian one that's maybe a few years older, but yeah.
Okay, yeah.
It's a bit vintage at this point.
And so you've mentioned some of the context for disclosure there in terms of when people access services or, if they've already got a legal issue or something that they're working with a lawyer and then they don't know whether they need to disclose to that lawyer if HIV is a relevant thing for that issue. Can you just briefly take me through, I guess, what the other contexts are for disclosure that the guide explicitly covers?
Yeah, of course. So it sort of ends up covering a whole range of areas of public life as well as personal relationships. So it covers things like consent laws, public health laws and obligations to take reasonable precautions. It also covers, to some extent, immigration law, and as well insurance and superannuation, which is one area where people living with HIV can encounter discrimination. So I would say, like most areas of life that you can think of where a person might be likely to encounter the law, there's potentially going to be a little section in the guide, whether it's brief or whether it's sort of a little bit more complicated and nuanced.
Great, thank you. Because I guess the first Victorian guide was published in 2020, and it was a collaboration with Living Positive Victoria. And we've recently just relaunched the guide. Can you take me through the changes in law that are covered in the updated guide?
Of course. I guess, there were sort of more changes in the law than my workload would have liked. There were actually quite a few. One of the main ones was consent laws. So a couple of years ago in Victoria, there was a new offence introduced for procuring a sexual act by fraud, which might be relevant in some circumstances to people living with HIV when they're having sex. There also are a few less circumstances where HIV might be relevant in employment. So sex work's been further decriminalised here in Victoria, which means that it's now lawful to do sex work if you live with HIV. There also are some new guidelines for healthcare workers. So healthcare workers living with the bloodborne virus can now clearly perform exposure-prone procedures, so things like surgery, as long as they meet a few guidelines, which have been implemented in the last couple of years. One of the other major ones were vilification law amendments, which actually aren't fully coming into effect yet. They'll come into effect mid-2026. But quite a few areas of law are for only the first guide was published, say, 5 years ago now. I can't count.
Yeah, definitely. But it is a good reminder, like the law is always changing, and it's not always in the kind of, I guess we have a broad decriminalisation trend in Australia, but that's also not always the case as well. So I think like it's important to always be kind of like monitoring these things, like for us and also for, how we kind of like can help our communities. So thank you for explaining that. HALC and LPV work together to update the guide. I'm interested, what was that process like for you, and what did you think the collaboration achieved?
It was great. It was honestly, I think, the feedback process was really iterative. So I think it helped us as lawyers as much as we try to kind of write the law out in a way that's user-friendly and readable, whilst, of course, maintaining its accuracy. I think it helped us to do that job better. There were points at which LPV was able to offer great feedback in terms of like, can we word this way, which might be a bit more understandable to our community here in Victoria. I think it also ensured that frequently asked questions were covered. So, for example, I remember in the privacy section, there were some discussions about, what if we put an example in here about when someone's HIV status is revealed on like a referral to, say, a physio or some other kind of allied health profession when it's not necessarily relevant to the services that they're delivering. So it hopefully made the guide more sort of user-friendly for the community that is intended to kind of be the audience.
Yeah, I thought it was really helpful as well, like in terms of the collaboration, because a lot of the kind of questions that we get in our workshops that are about like relationships or disclosure, or our legal education workshops as well. And often these are around, and with the new laws coming in around consent, it raised this question about whether a certain communication about your HIV status could be misleading, or anything about yourself could be misleading and kind of induce someone to have sex with you. It's very kind of formal language, and so when our community often has questions about that, like, could this be considered misleading, or could that be considered misleading? And I thought one of the really good parts of like the update of the guide is that we actually have a kind of list of scenarios now of different kinds of ways of communicating about safe sex and your HIV status, and kind of having that checked by HALC to say, oh, this could be considered misleading, or this one is not, was really, I thought, like a great update.
No, definitely. And I think as much as we can, sort of within the bounds of providing like accurate information, it was really good to be able to just sort of have some degree of clarity out there, because it's a really concerning change in Victoria, that sort of further criminalisation of non-disclosure. And I think rightfully, like, people are sort of worried about sort of falling foul of that law, and especially it's concerning when the law is worded in such a way that's just not that easy to necessarily understand for the everyday person. So yeah, a lot of those concepts kind of have specific legal meanings, like the elements that are necessary to breach Section 45. So I think it was great, and I think I liked the way that it was designed in the end with those scenarios.
And I guess that kind of, brings me to my next point as well, like those consent laws being new in Victoria. So HALC has guides, for most states in Australia. How do HIV-related laws differ across the country?
It's a great question, and we are doing work to sort of get some more information for those states that don't yet have a guide. So I sort of have spent quite a bit of time recently doing research for, and like more recent evidence gathering for HIV-related laws across the country. So there actually is quite a lot of uniformity. Many of the areas that we cover in the guide are regulated under Commonwealth law. So this includes insurance and superannuation, immigration, employment, and to some extent discrimination law, so the Disability Discrimination Act, which is a Commonwealth law. But at the same time, there are some notable differences. So just because there's a law or a regulation in one state, you can't necessarily assume it's the same in another state. So there are some sort of, you could say, niche differences. In Western Australia, for example, when you're getting a tattoo when you live with HIV, there's a legal obligation to disclose in that context. Also, consent law and reasonable precaution. So like this recent change in Victoria, those differ quite a lot across different states and territories in terms of, say, if there's any consequences that attach to not taking reasonable precautions, or even if there's any provision that talks about misrepresentations before sex relating to your HIV status, or the precautions you take to prevent the transmission of HIV. I guess the last one, as you can see, I can go on for a bit here, but the last one is privacy laws. So those differ quite a bit across Australia. So the ones that stand out are, there's a couple of states that don't even have a state privacy legislation, and so privacy protections in some contexts can be quite limited in those states. So South Australia, for example, and it used to be the case for Western Australia, but they have a privacy legislation, like a state-based privacy legislation, that comes into effect mid-2026.
Yeah, good to know. And I mean, and obviously great that HALC is aiming to provide national coverage for its guides and kind of services as well. But yeah, always good to kind of check what the local laws are like if you're moving across Australia. A lot of the demand we have for legal education at LPV is from people who've recently moved to Australia as well. They'll often come, with a different context or a different frame for what laws are like in their home country, and what and how common discrimination is there. And so yeah, it tends to be often migrants who are coming to us and wanting to kind of know things. So can you just for context in our audience, just briefly describe how laws in Australia compare to other countries?
Yeah, of course. I can on a sort of very high level. And yeah, we do sort of see those kind of differences in understanding amongst our client base quite a lot. Like a majority of our clients were born in a country other than Australia and have since migrated to Australia. And we sometimes see concerns about confidentiality and things like that, especially when they first come to us. So in general, I would say privacy protections are quite a bit stronger in Australia, as well as protections against things like discrimination or vilification. So in some other countries, for example, there's mandatory HIV testing before you apply for certain jobs. And there's also sort of quite harsh criminal sanctions to some extent, especially for HIV non-disclosure, exposure, or transmission. So unfortunately, sort of it can be a reality that people can be prosecuted for not telling others about their HIV status, even when they had a suppressed viral load, for example. We've also seen some clients come to us who were based overseas and they've been deported from certain countries just due to their HIV status. So they weren't a citizen in that country, they were just living there, and then once they were diagnosed, they were deported, and then they've approached HALC seeking advice on options to come to Australia as well. So yeah, it can differ quite a lot outside of Australia, and it can be difficult for people to understand once they move to Australia what the kind of obligations there are surrounding disclosure, if any.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's important to note as well, like sometimes as well, people, you can assume if there's less criminalization in Australia or less discrimination, that you're not that there aren't these risks as well. So it's good, to kind of be educating people about what kind of still is here. And I guess that takes me to my last point. Like the guide's really long. There's there's so many, like you said, like basically every area of public life and some areas of private life that it's covering. What do you think is the main takeaway that you hope people get from reading the guide?
I would say first and foremost, and this is kind of interesting coming from someone who sort of wrote or helped write like quite a long guide about disclosure, is that in most settings you actually probably don't have a legal obligation to disclose your status. That being said, it is really important to just check and just to kind of be aware of what your obligations are, if any, just to help sort of guide that decision making. And to do that, I think like whether you seek legal or non-legal support, like as lawyers, the answers we can provide are sometimes limited because there aren't necessarily legal many situations where you actually have to disclose. You don't have to disclose in employment in most employment settings, and you don't have to disclose generally in personal relationships, with that sort of caveat around consent laws in Victoria and some other states. So I think like non-legal support plays a really important role here, and I think organisations like LPV do a really great job of helping people in these situations.
Yeah, it's a really good message. I find, sometimes like a little bit of legal education can go a long way to helping people feel more empowered and less anxious about the consequences of non-disclosure, or that they basically most times have the right to privacy. It can make a really big difference to people, and work like our collaboration with HALC and the guide just make our work so much more easier to be able to work with people about like how to have relationships with HIV or just live their lives, like so
yeah, no, definitely. I think it's in some situations, for example, we'll advise someone, or you actually don't have to disclose your status, say they're accessing like a healthcare service or something like that. And I remember being asked like, oh, but what happens if they just like don't give me this service? And I'm like, well, that's unlawful. Like that would likely be discrimination in that situation. And so I think even just a brief conversation like that can help. And I think, like you say, sort of give people a little bit of confidence potentially about their legal rights after disclosure, if that's necessary.
Great. Okay, well, Beth, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode. To access the disclosure guides mentioned, head to lpv.org.au/disclosureguide. Support is also available at the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre by heading to halc.org.au. That's halc.org.au. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for all the latest episodes and join us on our social channels.